I should have known something was wrong the moment I saw the Pine Rest Motel. It squatted beside Route 9 like a wounded animal, its neon sign flickering intermittently against the October sky. Half the letters were dark, spelling out PNRST in sickly pink light. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a few cars scattered across the cracked asphalt like abandoned chess pieces. But I needed this job. After the breakup with Marcus and the subsequent financial hemorrhaging that comes with splitting a Boston apartment on a paralegal's salary, I'd been desperate enough to answer a Craigslist ad for overnight desk clerk at a quiet Maine motel. The pay was surprisingly good for such a remote location, and quiet nights sounded exactly like what I needed to piece my life back together. The motel office smelled of stale cigarettes and pine air freshener that had long since given up the fight. Behind the counter stood a man who introduced himself as Mr. Dalton, the manager. He was tall and gaunt, with hollow cheeks and fingers stained yellow from decades of smoking. His eyes had the peculiar quality of never quite meeting mine directly, always focusing on some point just over my left shoulder. "Claire Bennett?" he asked, though he'd already seen my driver's license. "Yes, sir. Ready to start tonight." He studied me for a long moment, taking a drag from his cigarette. "You sure about that? Working nights isn't for everyone. Gets lonely out here. Sometimes your mind plays tricks." I forced a smile. "I've worked late shifts before." "I'm a night owl anyway." Dalton nodded slowly, then reached under the counter and produced a laminated sheet of paper. The edges were worn smooth from handling, and the text looked like it had been typed on an old typewriter, then photocopied multiple times. "These are the rules," he said, sliding it across the counter. "Follow them exactly." I picked up the sheet and read overnight shift rules. Pine Rest Motel, always check the registry before giving a room key. Some guests are not meant to stay here. Do not answer the lobby phone after 2:13 a.m. If you see a guest twice in one night, only speak to the first one. Never unlock room 6. If someone knocks at the back door, ignore it. I looked up at Dalton, expecting to see a smirk or some indication. This was an elaborate joke meant to haze the new employee. Instead, his expression was deadly serious. Are you being serious?" I asked, unable to keep the nervous laugh out of my voice. "Dead serious." He stubbed out his cigarette in an overflowing ashtray. "Look, Claire, I know how it sounds, but this place has been here since 1962, and these rules have kept night clerks safe for just as long. Follow them or you won't last." "What do you mean, won't last? Like I'll get fired?" Dalton was already putting on his coat, a worn leather jacket that had seen better decades. "Just follow the rules, Claire. The guests start checking out early tomorrow. Day shift comes in at 7. Lock up when you leave." He paused at the door, his hand on the handle. "And Claire, if something feels wrong, trust that feeling. Don't try to rationalize it away." Then he was gone and I was alone. I stood behind the counter looking around the lobby with fresh eyes. The furniture was standard motel issue from maybe the 1980s, harvest gold and brown plaid that had probably never been fashionable. The fluorescent lights hummed with that particular frequency that gets under your skin after a while. Through the large windows, I could see the motel's U-shaped layout, 2 wings of rooms facing each other across a narrow parking lot. Most of the rooms were dark, but a few glowed with the blue flicker of television sets. I read the rules again, trying to make sense of them. The registry comment seemed reasonable enough. Maybe they had problems with people who'd been banned for non-payment or damage. But the phone rule was odd. Who calls a motel after 2 a.m.? And what was this about seeing guests twice? Did that mean people tried to sneak extra guests into their rooms? Room 6 was directly across from the office window. I could see its red door, identical to all the others except for the small 6 painted in white numerals. What could be wrong with a motel room that it should never be unlocked? Maybe it was damaged or had a mold problem or... I shook my head. I was overthinking this. Dalton was probably just an eccentric old man who'd been running this place too long. Small towns were full of people with odd superstitions and quirky rules. I'd humor him, follow his little list and collect my paycheck. The first few hours passed quietly. I familiarized myself with the computer system, which was mercifully more modern than the rest of the place. A trucker checked in around 11 p.m., paying cash and asking for a room on the ground floor. A young couple left around midnight, the woman looking relieved to be going. I waved goodbye and watched their taillights disappear down Route 9. By 1 a.m., The motel was silent, except for the constant hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of the building settling. I'd brought a book, but found myself staring out the window instead, watching the shadows between the pine trees that pressed close against the property line. The trees seemed too close, like they were trying to reclaim the land the motel had been built on. I was still staring when the lobby phone rang. The sound made me jump. I glanced at the clock, 2:14 a.m. The phone continued to ring, its shrill tone cutting through the quiet night. I reached for the receiver automatically, then stopped. Rule number 2, do not answer the lobby phone after 2:13 a.m., but that was ridiculous. What if it was an emergency? What if someone needed help? The ringing continued. 10 rings, 15, 20. My hand hovered over the phone. This was stupid. It was probably just someone looking for a room, or maybe a guest with a problem. I was being paid to provide customer service, not to ignore phone calls because of some arbitrary rule. But something in Dalton's voice when he'd said, "Follow them, or you won't last," made me hesitate. After 37 rings, the phone finally stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the ringing. I sat there, my heart beating faster than it should have been, staring at the silent phone. Why was I so on edge? It was just a phone call that I'd chosen not to answer. People hung up all the time, but then the radio crackled to life. The motel had an old AM/FM radio behind the counter, the kind with actual dials and a telescoping antenna. I hadn't touched it all night, and it had been silent. Now it hissed with static, and through the white noise I heard something that made my blood freeze. "Why didn't you pick up, Claire?" It was my mother's voice, soft, concerned, exactly the way she sounded when she was worried about me. But my mother lived in Connecticut. My mother didn't even know I was working at this motel. I hadn't told her about the job yet, hadn't told her about any of the recent changes in my life. The static swallowed the voice, and the radio fell silent. I stared at the radio for a long time, my hands shaking slightly. That hadn't happened. I was tired, stressed from the move and the new job and everything with Marcus. I was hearing things that weren't there, but I reached for the laminated rules again, and this time I read them with a different kind of attention. The rest of that first night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. I kept glancing at the radio, half expecting it to crackle to life again. The phone remained mercifully silent. When Dalton arrived at 7 a.m. to relieve me, I almost told him about the phone call and the radio. Almost instead, I just handed him the keys and said, "Quiet night." He looked at me with those hollow eyes. "Good. See you tomorrow night, Claire." I drove back to my small apartment in town, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard my mother's voice asking why I hadn't picked up the phone. The second night started much like the first. I arrived at 11 p.m., and Dalton briefed me on the few guests we had. A traveling salesman in room 12, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harrington in room 8 who'd been staying for several weeks, and a young family who'd checked in that afternoon and were leaving early the next morning. "Anything else I should know?" I asked. Dalton lit a cigarette and shook his head. "Just follow the rules, Claire. Trust the rules." After he left, I settled in behind the counter with my book and a thermos of coffee. The family checked out around 11:30, the father carrying a sleeping toddler, while the mother wheeled their suitcase to the car. They seemed eager to leave, barely acknowledging my goodbye. The traveling salesman emerged from his room around midnight, presumably to get something from his car. I watched him through the window as he rummaged through his trunk, then returned to his room. Standard motel behavior. Mrs. Harrington's room remained lit, and occasionally I could see her shadow moving past the curtains. Insomnia, maybe, or just someone who preferred the night hours. I understood that. Around 1:30 a.m. I was reading when I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. Through the window, I saw someone approaching the office. As they came into the light, I recognized the traveling salesman from room 12. He was a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a wrinkled shirt, carrying what looked like a briefcase. He entered the lobby, and I looked up with a professional smile. "Everything okay, Mr. Patterson?" He nodded but didn't speak, just stood there looking at me with an odd expression. His eyes seemed unfocused, and his smile was too wide, stretching his mouth in a way that didn't look quite natural. After a moment, he turned and walked back outside, still without saying a word. I watched him through the window as he crossed the parking lot, but instead of going to room 12, he simply walked into the shadows between the buildings and disappeared. That was strange, but not necessarily alarming. Maybe he'd gone for a walk or to the ice machine, or any number of normal things that traveling salesmen might do at 1:30 in the morning. 20 minutes later, I heard footsteps on gravel again. Mr. Patterson burst through the office door, looking harried and slightly out of breath. "Jesus, it's cold out there," he said, rubbing his hands together. "Sorry to bother you, but do you know if there's anywhere around here to get coffee? I've got an early meeting in Bangor and I need to stay awake." I stared at him. This was definitely Mr. Patterson. Same thinning hair, same wrinkled shirt, same briefcase. But 20 minutes ago I'd seen him walk into the shadows and vanish. And now here he was again, acting like this was his first trip to the office tonight. "There's a 24-hour diner about 10 miles south on Route 9, I managed to say. "Perfect, thanks." He started to leave, then turned back. "You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a laugh. "Just tired." Long night. After he left, actually left this time, I watched him get in his car and drive away. I pulled out the laminated rules with trembling fingers. Rule number 3. If you see a guest twice in one night, only speak to the first one. I had just spoken to the second, Mr. Patterson. I had violated the rules, but that was impossible. People don't just appear twice. There had to be a rational explanation. Maybe I'd been mistaken about the first sighting. Maybe it had been someone else, and in the dim light, I'd confused them for Mr. Patterson. Maybe the lobby phone rang. I checked the clock, 2:16 a.m. This time I didn't even consider answering it. I sat perfectly still, letting it ring, counting each shrill tone. The sound seemed louder tonight, more insistent, as if it knew I was there and knew I was ignoring it. After 43 rings, it stopped. The silence stretched for maybe 30 seconds. Then the radio crackled. "Claire, honey, why won't you talk to me?" My mother's voice again, but different this time. Hurt, confused, the way she'd sounded when I was 16 and had been caught sneaking out to a party. "I know you're there, sweetheart. I can see you." I spun around, looking frantically through the windows. The parking lot was empty, except for Mrs. Harrington's car and my own. The rooms were dark and quiet. There was no one there who could see me. "Please pick up the phone next time. I miss you so much." The static swallowed her voice and the radio went silent. I sat there for a long time staring at the radio, my heart hammering against my ribs. This wasn't stress or exhaustion, or my imagination. Something was very wrong with this place, and whatever was wrong knew my name, knew my mother's voice, and apparently knew that I wasn't following some arbitrary rules that should have been meaningless. I looked across the parking lot at room 6, its red door barely visible in the shadows. What was behind that door that should never be unlocked? What would happen if I broke that rule the way I'd apparently broken rule number 3? I didn't want to find out. But as I sat there in the humming fluorescent light, watching the shadows between the pine trees, I realized that wanting might not matter. Something had noticed me now, something that could wear the faces of motel guests and speak with the voice of my mother, and I had the unsettling feeling that it was just getting started. On my third night, I met Evan. I was doing paperwork around 10:30 p.m. when I heard someone working on the ice machine outside. Through the window, I could see a man in his late 20s with sandy hair and work clothes, tinkering with the machine's electrical panel. When he finished, he knocked on the office door. "Hey there," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "I'm Evan Morrison. I do maintenance work around here sometimes. Dalton asked me to fix the ice machine before it completely died." I introduced myself, and Evan leaned against the doorframe with the easy confidence of someone who belonged here. He had an irreverent smile and the kind of casual manner that suggested he didn't take much seriously. "So you're the new night clerk," he said. "How are you liking our little slice of paradise?" "It's quiet," I said carefully. Evan laughed. "That's one word for it. Let me guess. Dalton gave you his special list of rules, right? The laminated one that looks like it was typed on a typewriter from the Carter administration." I nodded, surprised by his direct approach to what I'd assumed was a sensitive topic. "Don't tell me you actually believe that stuff," Evan said, still grinning. "It's just Dalton's way of messing with new employees. Scare tactics to keep you from slacking off or stealing from the till. You don't think there's anything to them? Claire, I've been working around this place on and off for 3 years. I've broken every single one of those rules, sometimes multiple times in one night. Nothing's ever happened except Dalton getting pissy if he finds out. Evan glanced at his watch. In fact, I should probably get going. Left my good tools in the back lot and it's supposed to rain tonight. He headed for the door, then turned back with a mischievous expression. Tell you what, I'll prove it to you. Watch this. Evan walked around to the back of the building, disappearing from my view. A few minutes later, I heard 3 deliberate knocks on the back door. Rule number 5, if someone knocks at the back door, ignore it. The knocking came again, louder this time. Then Evan's voice, Claire! It's me, Evan. I locked myself out. I smiled despite myself. He was obviously trying to prove his point about the rules being meaningless. The knocking continued for another minute, then stopped. A few minutes later, Evan reappeared at the front door, grinning broadly. See? Nothing happened. Just me standing in the cold like an idiot, proving that Dalton's rules are complete nonsense. But as he spoke, I noticed something odd. Evan's clothes were completely dry, even though it had started to drizzle, and his work boots, which had been dusty when he'd first introduced himself, were now clean. How did you get around to the back so quickly? I asked. His grin faltered slightly. What do you mean? It only took you a couple of minutes, but the building is pretty big. And your clothes aren't wet. Evan looked down at himself, then back at me. For just a moment his expression was confused, almost lost. Then the confident smile returned. Must have been longer than I thought. Time flies when you're proving a point. After he left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about our interaction had been off. The timeline didn't make sense, and there had been something strange about his expression when I'd questioned him about the back door. But I didn't have long to think about it. Because around 1:45 a.m., I saw Evan again. He was standing in the lobby doorway just at the edge of the light. This time he wasn't smiling. His face was pale and blank, and his eyes seemed to look right through me. He stood there for maybe 30 seconds, perfectly still, then turned and walked away into the darkness. I watched him go, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the October night. That was definitely Evan. Same height, same build, same sandy hair. But the expression on his face had been completely different from the confident, joking man I'd met earlier. Rule number 3. If you see a guest twice in one night, only speak to the first one. Evan wasn't a guest, but the rule seemed to apply to anyone, and I had just seen him for the second time tonight. 20 minutes later, the front door burst open and Evan stumbled in, his face flushed with cold and his clothes damp with rain. He was carrying a toolbox and looked thoroughly miserable. Jesus Christ, it's freezing out there, he said, setting down his tools. Sorry to bother you again, but I left my good wrench set in the back lot, and now it's raining hard enough to drown a fish. Mind if I warm up for a minute before I head home? I stared at him. This was the 3rd time I'd seen Evan tonight. First when he'd introduced himself and knocked on the back door, then standing silently in the doorway, and now bursting in from the cold. But according to rule number 3, I should only speak to the first one. Claire, you okay? Evan was looking at me with concern. You look like you've seen a ghost. I wanted to answer him, wanted to ask him about the figure I'd seen in the doorway, wanted to understand what was happening. But the memory of my mother's voice on the radio and the strange doubling of Mr. Patterson held me back. Instead, I just nodded and pointed to the coffee pot in the corner. Evan looked hurt by my lack of response, but he poured himself a cup of coffee and stood by the window, looking out at the rain. Weird night, he muttered. Feel like I've been walking in circles for hours. He finished his coffee in silence and left without saying goodbye. I watched him drive away, his headlights cutting through the rain and darkness. But as his taillights disappeared down Route 9, I found myself wondering which Evan had been real. The confident joker who'd knocked on the back door, the silent figure in the doorway, or the cold and confused man who'd just left? And more importantly, what had happened to the other 2? The lobby phone started ringing at exactly 2:13 a.m. I didn't answer it, but I counted the rings anyway. 52 this time, each one seeming to stretch longer than the last. When it finally stopped, the radio remained silent. But I could swear I heard something else in the quiet that followed, the sound of footsteps on gravel, circling the building over and over again, as if someone was trapped in an endless loop, trying to find their way inside. The next day I called the motel's main number and asked to speak with Evan Morrison. Evan? Dalton's voice was carefully neutral. Haven't seen him around lately. Why? He was here last night working on the ice machine. There was a long pause. Ice machine's been broken for 2 weeks, Claire. I've been meaning to call someone to fix it. After I hung up, I stood in my apartment kitchen staring at the phone. Either Dalton was lying, or something very strange was happening at the Pine Rest Motel. Given what I'd experienced over the past few nights, I was starting to suspect the latter. That evening I arrived early for my shift. Dalton was in the office smoking and doing paperwork as usual. "Mr. Dalton," I said, "I need to ask you something. How long have you been the manager here?" He looked up at me with those hollow eyes. 23 years, why? Have you ever had problems with the night shift? Employees who didn't work out? His expression darkened. Some. Night work isn't for everyone, like I told you. What happened to them? They quit. Or stopped showing up, or... He took a long drag from his cigarette. Or they stopped following the rules. What happens when someone stops following the rules? Dalton studied me for a long moment. You having problems, Claire? Because if you are, now's the time to tell me. I wanted to tell him about the phone calls, about seeing guests twice, about Evan's strange behavior. But something in his expression warned me off. Instead, I just shook my head. No problems. Just curious about the history of the place. After Dalton left, I spent some time exploring the office more thoroughly. In the storage closet behind the desk, I found boxes of old paperwork, maintenance records and guest registries dating back decades. Some of the boxes were water damaged, and many of the papers were too faded to read clearly. But I managed to piece together fragments of the motel's history. The Pine Rest had been built in 1962 by a local businessman named Harold Pine, who'd envisioned it as a stopping point for travelers heading to and from Acadia National Park. For the first few years, business had been good. But sometime in the late 1960s, things had started to go wrong. I found a police report from 1969 about a night clerk named Janet Morrison who had disappeared during her shift. Her car was still in the parking lot, her purse was behind the counter, but she was nowhere to be found. The investigation had turned up nothing. In 1973, another night clerk, Robert Stenhouse, had been found in the morning sitting behind the counter, staring straight ahead and completely unresponsive. He'd been taken to a psychiatric facility and had never spoken coherently again. There were other incidents scattered throughout the decades, employees who'd quit after a single night, guests who'd checked in but were never seen leaving, maintenance workers who'd reported strange occurrences and been dismissed as unreliable. But most interesting were the handwritten notes in the margins of some of the guest registries. They appeared to be observations from various night clerks over the years. Phone rang 73 times after 2 a.m. Didn't answer. Good thing. 1984. Guest in room 9 came to office twice. Second one wasn't right. Eyes too dark. 1991, something knocking at back door all night. Sounded like a child crying. Don't trust it. 1997, room 6 door was open this morning. Supposed to be locked. Found manager's keys on floor inside. Don't remember unlocking it. 2003, and then in a more recent register from 2019, an entry that made my blood run cold. They look like us but aren't. Don't give them keys. Don't speak to them. If you answer the phone, they'll know your name. They'll know everything. Sarah K. The handwriting was shaky, desperate. Below her note, someone else had written, Sarah didn't show up for her shift. Car found in the lake. Ruled suicide. I sat back, feeling sick. This wasn't just a case of eccentric management or local superstition. Something was genuinely wrong with this place. Something that had been going on for decades. The rules weren't arbitrary. They were a survival guide written in the blood of previous night clerks. I was so absorbed in the old records that I almost missed the sound of footsteps outside. Looking through the window, I saw Mrs. Harrington walking slowly across the parking lot. She was wearing a bathrobe and slippers, which seemed odd for a woman in her 70s to be wandering around outside after midnight. She knocked on the office door, the front door. Thankfully, not the back, and I let her in. Mrs. Harrington, is everything all right? She looked at me with eyes that seemed much sharper than her elderly appearance suggested. You're reading the old records, she said. It wasn't a question. How did you know? Because you have the look. The same look they all get when they start to understand. She sat down in one of the lobby chairs, folding her hands in her lap. How long have you been working here, dear? 4 nights? 4 nights. She nodded slowly. You're doing better than most. Some don't make it past the second night. Mrs. Harrington, what's happening here? What are those rules really about? The old woman was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the dark shapes of the pine trees. This place is thin, she said finally. The boundary between what is and what shouldn't be. They come through the gaps, wearing familiar faces, speaking with familiar voices. The rules are the only things that keep them in check. They? I don't know what they are exactly. Echoes, maybe. Reflections of people who've been here before. They want in, want to be real, want to replace us. She looked at me directly. You've seen them, haven't you? The doubles. I nodded, thinking of the 2 versions of Mr. Patterson, the 3 appearances of Evan. Don't think you can outsmart them, Mrs. Harrington continued. Don't think you can help them or communicate with them or understand them. The rules exist for a reason. Follow them exactly, or you'll end up like the others. What others? But Mrs. Harrington was already standing up, pulling her bathrobe tighter around her frail shoulders. You'll find out, dear. Or maybe you won't. That's up to you now. She left me alone in the office, surrounded by boxes of old records and the weight of decades of strange occurrences. Outside, the pine trees swayed in a wind I couldn't hear, and the shadows between them seemed deeper than they should have been. The lobby phone started ringing at 2:13 a.m., exactly as it had every night. But this time, as I sat there refusing to answer it, I noticed something I'd missed before. The display on the phone showed the caller ID, Pine Rest Motel. The call was coming from inside the building. The revelation about the caller ID haunted me through the remainder of that shift and into the next day. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a glitch in the phone system, or perhaps one of the rooms had a phone that was malfunctioning. But I couldn't shake the image of that display, Pine Rest Motel calling itself at 2:13 every morning. When I arrived for my 5th night, Mrs. Harrington was waiting for me in the lobby. She sat in one of the faded chairs like she'd been there for hours, her hands folded over a worn leather purse. Evening. Claire, she said as I came through the door. Mrs. Harrington, is everything okay with your room? Room's fine, dear. I wanted to talk to you before your shift started. She gestured to the chair beside her. Sit with me for a moment. I glanced around, but Dalton had already left and the lobby was empty, except for the 2 of us. I sat down, noticing how the fluorescent lights made her skin look almost translucent. You've been reading the old records, she said. Learning about the history of this place. How do you know that? Mrs. Harrington smiled, but it was a sad expression. Because I helped write some of those records. I've been here a very long time, Claire. Longer than most people think. What do you mean? I mean, I was here in 1969 when Janet Morrison disappeared. I was here in 1973 when Robert Stenhouse lost his mind. I've seen night clerks come and go for decades, and most of them don't last long. She leaned forward slightly. But some do. Some learn to follow the rules and survive. I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. That's impossible. You'd have to be old? Yes, dear, I'm very old. Older than I look, older than I should be. Her eyes seemed to grow darker as she spoke. This place has a way of preserving things that should have moved on long ago. Are you saying you're not really a guest here? I'm saying I'm something in between. Not quite alive, not quite dead, not quite real, not quite fake. I exist in the spaces where the rules apply. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook. This is everything I've learned about surviving this place. Consider it a more detailed version of Dalton's rules. I took the notebook with trembling hands. The leather was worn smooth, and the pages were filled with cramped handwriting in various pens and pencils, as if it had been written over many years. Why are you helping me? Mrs. Harrington stood up slowly, adjusting her cardigan. Because you remind me of myself when I first started working here. Smart enough to be scared, but too stubborn to run. She paused at the office door. And because I don't want to be alone anymore. After she left, I opened the notebook. The first page was dated 1969 and written in a young woman's handwriting. Rules learned the hard way. Written by Janet Morrison. Night clerk, Pine Rest Motel. The official rules are just the beginning. Here's what they don't tell you. Rule 1 expanded. The registry will sometimes show guests who aren't really there. Look for names written in different handwriting, or rooms that show as occupied when they're clearly empty. These are the echoes trying to get in. Don't give them keys. Rule 2. Expanded. The phone calls after 2:13 a.m. are never from real people. They're from the echoes, trying to learn your voice, your name, your weaknesses. The longer you listen, the more they learn. Rule 3 expanded. The doubles always appear in a specific order. The first one is usually the most convincing, acting normally. The second one is often wrong in subtle ways. Wrong clothes, wrong expression, wrong timing. The third one, if there is one, is usually overtly threatening or wrong. Only the first one is safe to interact with. Rule 4 expanded. Room 6 is where they gather. It's not really locked. The lock is just for show. But opening that door lets them out all at once. Don't ever, under any circumstances, go near room 6 after midnight. Rule 5 expanded. The knocking at the back door will get more desperate and convincing as the night goes on. They'll use the voices of people you know, people you care about. They'll claim to be hurt, lost, or in danger. It's all lies. The back door leads to the space between spaces. Opening it doesn't let someone in. It lets you out into somewhere you can't come back from. The entries continued for pages, written in different handwritings and dating all the way up to recent years. Each night clerk who'd survived long enough had added their own observations, their own hard-learned lessons. They can't create new information, only twist what they already know. If someone tells you something you never told anyone, it's probably real. If they repeat back something you said earlier, it's probably an echo. Robert S., 1973. The ice machine doesn't just break randomly. It breaks when they're trying to manifest physically. The electrical interference from their presence messes with anything that runs on a circuit. Maria L., 1987. Mrs. Harrington isn't what she seems, but she's not dangerous. She's like a lighthouse in the dark. Follow her guidance, but remember that even lighthouses eventually run out of power. David P., 1995. The radio will play anything they want you to hear. Your mother's voice, your ex-lover, your dead grandmother. It's all fake. But the static is real. When you hear static with no voices, that means you're safe for the moment. Amanda R., 2008. They're getting stronger. Each year the rules need to be followed more exactly, and the consequences for breaking them get worse. I don't know what they want, but I know they're patient. They can wait forever. Michael T., 2015, the final entry was recent, written in shaky handwriting that I recognized from the guest registry. They know my name now. They know everything about me. I can hear them in the walls, behind the mirrors, under the floorboards. The rules aren't enough anymore. If you're reading this, I'm probably already gone. Don't make the same mistakes I did. Don't try to understand them. Don't try to help them. Don't try to communicate with them. Just survive. Sarah K., 2019. I closed the notebook, feeling nauseous. Sarah K., the night clerk who'd supposedly committed suicide. But according to this, she hadn't killed herself. She'd been taken by whatever haunted this place. I looked up at the clock. 11:47 p.m. The night was just beginning, and I already felt like I was drowning in the weight of all this hidden history. How many people had sat in this same chair, reading these same desperate warnings, trying to make sense of an impossible situation? Through the window, I could see room 6 across the parking lot. Its red door looked the same as all the others, but now I knew what the previous night clerks had learned the hard way. It wasn't really a room at all. It was something else, somewhere else, wearing the disguise of a motel room. Mrs. Harrington had called me smart enough to be scared, but too stubborn to run. As I sat there in the humming fluorescent light, surrounded by the evidence of decades of supernatural predation, I realized she was right. I was terrified, but I wasn't going anywhere. The question was, would I be strong enough to survive what was coming, or would I end up as just another entry in someone else's notebook? Another cautionary tale for the next night clerk, foolish enough to take the job. The lobby phone would start ringing in a little over 2 hours, and this time I had a feeling it was going to be much worse than my mother's voice, asking why I hadn't picked up. The 6th night started quietly, but I could feel the tension building like atmospheric pressure before a storm. I had memorized much of Mrs. Harrington's notebook, and every shadow outside seemed pregnant with possibility. The motel had only 2 guests, Mrs. Harrington herself, and a middle-aged businessman who'd checked in that afternoon and seemed normal enough. Around 1 a.m., I was reviewing the notebook entries when I heard a car pull into the parking lot. Through the window, I watched as a young woman got out of a beat-up Honda Civic, looking around nervously. She was maybe 25, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and clothes that suggested she'd been driving for a long time. She came into the office, and I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "Hi," she said, her voice hoarse. "I need a room for the night. Just me." I checked her ID, Lisa Chen from Boston, and started the check-in process. She paid cash, which wasn't unusual for a place like the Pine Rest, but I noticed her hands were shaking slightly as she counted out the bills. "You okay?" I asked. She looked up at me, and for a moment I saw something desperate in her expression. "Just tired." "Long drive," she paused. "This place is safe, right? I mean, it's not—" "There's nothing weird about it." I thought about the notebook hidden under the counter, about all the warnings and rules and decades of strange occurrences. "It's quiet," I said finally. "Very quiet." She seemed to take some comfort in that, and I gave her the key to room 14, well away from the problematic areas I'd learned about. After she left, I watched her through the window as she unloaded a single suitcase from her car. She kept looking over her shoulder, as if she expected to be followed. The next 2 hours passed without incident. Lisa's room remained lit, and occasionally I could see her shadow moving behind the curtains. The businessman's room was dark and quiet. Mrs. Harrington's room showed no signs of activity, though I'd learned not to assume that meant she was actually sleeping. At 2:13 a.m., the lobby phone began to ring. I let it ring, counting each tone as I'd done every night, but this time it stopped after only 15 rings, which was unusual. Normally it would continue for at least 40 or 50 rings before giving up. The silence that followed felt different too, heavier, more expectant. Then I heard something that made my blood freeze, a child's voice, calling from somewhere outside. "Hello? Is anyone there? Please, I need help." The voice was coming from the direction of the back door. A little boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, crying and scared. "Please, I'm lost. I'm so cold." I gripped the edge of the counter, fighting every instinct I had. Rule number 5, if someone knocks at the back door, ignore it. But this wasn't knocking. This was a child in distress. My mum and dad were in an accident. I ran away and now I can't find them. "Please, I just need to get warm." The voice was heartbreaking, full of genuine terror and confusion. What kind of monster would ignore a lost child? But Mrs. Harrington's notebook had been clear. They would use the voices of people you cared about, people you wanted to help. They would make it seem real, make it seem urgent. I can see the lights inside. "I know someone's there. Please don't leave me out here." I stood up, took a step toward the back of the office. Every fiber of my being screamed that I needed to help this child. Rules or no rules, supernatural warnings or not, I couldn't just let a little boy freeze to death outside. "Please, lady, I can see you through the window. Why won't you help me?" That stopped me cold. There was no window facing the back door from inside the office. The back door opened onto a small service area, surrounded by dumpsters and maintenance equipment. There was no way for anyone outside that door to see into the office. But the voice continued, now with a note of petulance creeping in alongside the fear. "I know you're there. I can smell you. Why won't you open the door? I can smell you." That phrase sent ice through my veins. No lost child would say that. No human child would say that. I forced myself to sit back down, but the voice didn't give up. "Fine, I'll wait. I'm very patient. I can wait all night if I need to." The crying stopped abruptly, as if someone had flipped a switch. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the desperate pleading had been. I sat there for 10 minutes, my heart hammering, before I worked up the courage to check the back door. I crept through the office to the small rear hallway, moving as quietly as possible. The back door was solid wood with no window, but there was a small peephole installed at eye level. I looked through it and immediately wished I hadn't. There was a boy standing outside, or something that looked like a boy. He appeared to be about 9 years old, with dark hair and clothes that looked like they came from decades past, but his eyes were completely black, and his mouth was stretched in a smile that was far too wide for a human face. He was looking directly at the peephole, as if he knew I was watching. "I see you," he said, his voice muffled by the door but clearly audible. "Why won't you let me in?" I stumbled backward, my heart racing. The boy, the thing, had known I was there. It had known exactly where to look. "I'm cold," it said, and now its voice sounded different, older, hungrier. "I've been cold for such a long time. Let me in and I'll get warm." I retreated to the front office, but I could still hear it talking, its voice growing fainter but more insistent. I know about the rules. I know you think you're safe, but rules can be broken. Rules are just suggestions. And I'm very persuasive. The voice faded, but I didn't trust that it was gone. I sat behind the counter, gripping Mrs. Harrington's notebook like a lifeline, trying to control my breathing. I had almost opened that door. If not for the detail about seeing me through a non-existent window, I would have broken rule number 5 and let that thing inside. The thought of what might have happened made me physically sick, but the worst part was that it had looked like a real child. Sounded like a real child in genuine distress. How was I supposed to distinguish between actual emergencies and supernatural predation? What if someday there really was a lost child who needed help, and I ignored them because of these rules? The moral weight of that possibility was almost unbearable. But the alternative, opening the door to something wearing a child's face and inviting it inside, was worse. I spent the rest of the night in a state of hypervigilance, jumping at every sound, checking and rechecking the locks on both doors. When dawn finally came and Dalton arrived to relieve me, I felt like I'd aged 10 years in one night. "Everything all right, Claire?" he asked, taking in my pale face and shaking hands. "A child," I said. "There was a child at the back door, crying, asking for help." Dalton's expression grew very serious. "You didn't open it?" "No, but I wanted to. God help me, I wanted to." He nodded slowly. "That's the hardest part. They know exactly which buttons to push, exactly what will make you want to break the rules. But Claire," he looked at me with those hollow eyes, "if you'd opened that door, you wouldn't be here right now to tell me about it." As I drove home that morning, I couldn't shake the image of the boy with the black eyes and the too wide smile. Somewhere in the rational part of my mind, I knew it hadn't been real. But it had seemed real enough in the moment. Real enough to almost trick me into making a fatal mistake. The rules weren't just arbitrary limitations. They were a buffer between the normal world and something that wanted very badly to cross over. And I was starting to understand that my role as night clerk wasn't just to check in guests and answer phones. I was a guard, standing watch at the boundary between what was and what shouldn't be. And something on the other side was getting very tired of being kept out. On my 7th night, everything went wrong at once. I arrived to find the parking lot fuller than I'd ever seen it. 6 cars scattered across the asphalt, which meant the motel was nearly at capacity. Dalton was in the office, chain-smoking and looking more haggard than usual. "Busy night coming up," he said without preamble. "Storms moving in from the coast. Power companies already talking about outages." As if to emphasize his point, the lights flickered briefly. What should I do if the power goes out? Dalton handed me a heavy flashlight and a battery-powered radio. "Follow the rules. Storm or no storm, power or no power, the rules don't change." He paused at the door. "Claire, if things get bad tonight, remember what I told you the first day. Trust your instincts." After he left, I checked the guest registry. Mrs. Harrington was still in room 8, of course. The businessman had checked out that afternoon. Lisa Chen was still in room 14. But there were also new guests. A family with 2 young children in room 3, an elderly couple in room 10, and a single man named Thomas Ward in room 12. I studied Thomas Ward's registration. Something about his handwriting bothered me. It was too perfect, too uniform, like it had been produced by a machine rather than a human hand. And his address was listed as simply Maine, with no city or street number. Through the window I could see storm clouds building on the horizon, illuminated by occasional flashes of lightning. The wind was picking up, making the pine trees sway and creak ominously. The first sign of trouble came around 11:30 p.m., when Lisa Chen appeared at the office door. She looked even more exhausted than she had the night before, with dark circles under her eyes and a haunted expression. "I need to check out," she said without explanation. "Is everything all right with your room?" "The room's fine. It's—" She glanced over her shoulder at the parking lot. "I need to leave now." I processed her checkout, but as she was leaving, she turned back to me. "Be careful tonight," she said. "Something's watching this place. Something that doesn't belong here." After she drove away, I felt increasingly uneasy. Lisa had seemed genuinely frightened, and her warning echoed the feelings I'd been having all week. But I was committed to seeing this through, to understanding what was really happening at the Pine Rest Motel. Around 1 a.m., I saw Thomas Ward for the first time. He came out of room 12, and walked slowly across the parking lot, stopping directly in front of the office window. He was a tall, thin man in an expensive-looking suit, with pale skin and dark hair slicked back from his forehead. But it was his eyes that made me uncomfortable. They seemed too dark, too deep, like looking into wells. He stood there for several minutes, just staring at me through the glass. I tried to look busy with paperwork, but I could feel his gaze like a physical weight. When I finally looked up again, he was gone. 10 minutes later, he appeared at the office door. "Good evening," he said, his voice cultured and smooth. "I was wondering if you might have a different room available. Something on the ground floor, perhaps closer to the office. Is there a problem with room 12? "Not exactly a problem, but I find myself restless tonight. I think a change of scenery might help." Everything about this interaction felt wrong. His smile was too wide, his movements too fluid, and there was something off about the way he spoke, as if he was choosing each word very carefully. "I'm sorry, but we're fully booked tonight," I lied. Thomas Ward's smile didn't waver, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Are you certain?" "I could have sworn I saw someone leave earlier." He was right, Lisa had checked out. "But something told me that giving this man a room closer to the office would be a very bad idea. All our remaining rooms are on the second floor," I said firmly. "I see." He studied me for a moment longer. "Well, I suppose room 12 will have to suffice. Good evening, Miss Bennett." I hadn't told him my name. I watched him walk back across the parking lot, noting that his footsteps made no sound on the gravel. At 2 a.m. the storm hit in earnest. Lightning flashed constantly, illuminating the motel in stark black and white, and thunder rolled across the sky like artillery fire. The rain came down in sheets, turning the parking lot into a series of puddles and streams. At 2:13 a.m., the power went out. The lobby plunged into darkness, broken only by my flashlight and the occasional flash of lightning through the windows. In the sudden silence, I could hear the battery-powered radio crackling with static, but the phone didn't ring. For the first time since I'd started working here, 2:13 came and went without the lobby phone ringing. Somehow that was more disturbing than if it had rung as usual. In the flashlight beam, I saw that the guest registry was open on the counter, though I was sure I'd closed it earlier. New names had appeared on the page, written in that same perfect, mechanical handwriting: Janet Morrison. Room 6, Robert Stenhouse. Room 6, Sarah Kelly. Room 6, all the names from Mrs. Harrington's notebook. All the night clerks who'd disappeared or died over the years. According to the registry, they were all staying in room 6. Lightning flashed, and in its brief illumination, I saw a figure standing in the parking lot. It was Thomas Ward, but he wasn't alone. There were others with him, shadowy forms that seemed to shift and waver in the intermittent light. Another flash, and I saw more figures. They were emerging from between the buildings, from the shadows under the pine trees, from spaces that should have been empty. All of them were moving slowly toward room 6. I grabbed Mrs. Harrington's notebook and flipped through it by flashlight, looking for guidance about power outages. I found an entry from 1987. When the power goes out, they get stronger. The electrical field that keeps them contained weakens, and they can manifest more easily. Stay in the office. Don't go outside. Don't open any doors. Especially don't open room 6. As if summoned by my reading, a loud crash echoed across the parking lot. Through the window, I could see that the door to room 6 was shaking violently, as if something enormous was throwing itself against it from the inside. The door held, but I could see the frame beginning to splinter. Another crash, and this time I heard something else. Voices calling from inside the room. Multiple voices overlapping and desperate. "Let us out. We've been waiting so long. We just want to go home. Please, we're so cold in here." One voice rose above the others, and I recognized it immediately. It was Evan's voice, but distorted, echoing strangely. "Claire, Claire, help me. I'm trapped in here. Please, you have to unlock the door." Every instinct I had screamed at me to help. These were people in distress, people who needed me. But I forced myself to remember the notebook, the rules, the warnings that had been written in blood and desperation over decades. The voices from room 6 weren't real. They were echoes, reflections, things that wore familiar faces and spoke with familiar voices but weren't human at all. The crashing stopped suddenly, and the parking lot fell silent, except for the storm. But in the next lightning flash, I saw that room 6's door was standing wide open. Dark shapes began pouring out of the room, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. They moved across the parking lot like smoke, flowing toward the office. I could see faces in the darkness, some familiar, some strange. I saw Janet Morrison, young and terrified. I saw Robert Stenhouse, his face blank and staring. I saw Sarah Kelly, reaching toward me with desperate hands, and I saw Evan, looking exactly as he had that first night, confident and smiling. "Claire," he called, his voice carrying clearly despite the storm. "You don't have to be afraid. We're here to help you. We understand what you've been going through." The shadow figures pressed against the office windows, their faces mere inches from the glass. Some looked human, others were distorted beyond recognition. All of them were staring at me with hungry eyes. "Let us in, Claire," Evan continued. "You're all alone out here. Wouldn't it be nice to have company? Wouldn't it be nice to not be afraid anymore?" I backed away from the windows, clutching the flashlight and the notebook. The shadows followed my movement, pressing closer against the glass. "We know you're scared," said a voice that sounded like my mother. "We know you're tired. Just open the door, sweetheart. Let us take care of you." More voices joined in, a chorus of familiar tones. "Claire, it's okay. We're here for you. You don't have to be alone. Just open the door." The voices were hypnotic, soothing, exactly what I wanted to hear after days of fear and isolation. It would be so easy to give in, to open the door and let them in, to stop fighting and let someone else take responsibility. But something in Mrs. Harrington's notebook caught my eye. An entry I'd missed before, written in shaky handwriting. "When they all come at once, when they surround you and try to convince you to let them in, remember this: they need your permission. They need you to open the door voluntarily. The rules aren't just guidelines. They're a binding contract. As long as you follow them, as long as you don't give them permission to enter, they can't touch you." I stood in the center of the dark office, surrounded by hungry shadows, and made my choice. "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The voices outside grew more insistent. "Claire, please, we're your friends. You're making a mistake." "No," I said again, louder this time. The shadows pressed closer, and I could hear scratching at the windows, at the doors. But the glass held and the locks held, and gradually the sounds began to fade. "You can't hide in there forever, Claire," Evan's voice called, but it was growing distant. "We'll be waiting when you come out." One by one, the shadows began to retreat. They flowed back across the parking lot like smoke, disappearing into the darkness between the buildings. The last thing I saw before they vanished completely was Room 6's door swinging shut with a sound like a gunshot. The storm began to subside, and eventually the power flickered back on. The lobby was suddenly bright and normal again, as if nothing had happened. But when I looked at the guest registry, the names were gone. The page was blank, except for the legitimate guests who had checked in earlier. I sat behind the counter for the rest of the night, shaking and exhausted, but strangely triumphant. I had faced the ultimate test and survived. I had seen what lay behind the rules and chosen to follow them anyway. When dawn came and Dalton arrived for the morning shift, he took one look at my face and nodded slowly. "Bad night?" he asked. "The worst," I replied, "but you made it through." "I made it through." He smiled for the first time since I'd known him, a genuine, warm expression that transformed his entire face. "Welcome to the club, Claire. You're one of us now." The 8th night was the quietest I'd experienced since starting at the Pine Rest Motel. Only 3 guests were registered: Mrs. Harrington, the elderly couple in room 10, and surprisingly, Thomas Ward was still listed in room 12. Though I hadn't seen him since the night of the storm, I arrived for my shift feeling different, hollow but also strangely settled. Surviving the events of the previous night had changed something fundamental in me. The constant fear was still there, but it had transformed into something else, acceptance maybe, or resignation. I understood now that this place operated by rules that had nothing to do with the normal world, and fighting against that understanding was futile. Dalton was in the office when I arrived, smoking as usual, but his demeanor toward me had shifted. He no longer watched me with the worried concern of a manager, wondering if his new employee would last. Instead, he looked at me with something approaching respect. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Different," I said honestly. "Like I've been let in on a secret I never wanted to know." He nodded. "That feeling never really goes away. You just learn to live with it." He stubbed out his cigarette and stood up. Claire, there's something I need to tell you. About this place, about why the rules exist, about what you're really doing here. I waited, sensing that whatever he was about to say would explain things I'd been wondering about for days. The Pine Rest Motel isn't just a business, Dalton continued. It's a kind of containment facility. The things you've seen, the echoes, the shadows, they're drawn to thin places in reality, and this stretch of highway happens to be one of the thinnest. Without someone here to maintain the barriers, to enforce the rules, they would spread. They would find their way into the world beyond this place. So I'm not just a night clerk. No, you're a guardian, a keeper of boundaries. The rules aren't arbitrary. They're a binding spell written over decades by people who learned through trial and error how to keep the darkness contained. He looked at me with those hollow eyes. It's a big responsibility, Claire, and it's not one you can walk away from easily. What do you mean? I mean this place has a way of holding on to people who understand it. You could quit, of course. Walk away tonight and never come back. But the knowledge you've gained, the things you've seen, they'll follow you. You'll find yourself checking hotel registries for names that don't belong. You'll refuse to answer phones after certain times. You'll look for the rules wherever you go, because you'll know they exist even if nobody else does. I thought about that, about the idea of carrying this burden for the rest of my life. It should have terrified me, but instead, I felt a strange kind of peace. At least here I understood the rules. At least here following them meant something. The night passed without major incident. Mrs. Harrington stopped by the office around midnight, looking more solid and present than I'd ever seen her. You did well, she said simply. Better than most. How long have you really been here? I asked. She smiled, and for a moment I could see the young woman she had once been. Long enough to see dozens of night clerks come and go. Long enough to understand that some battles are worth fighting, even if you can never really win them. Are you really Janet Morrison? I was once. Now I'm something else. Something in between. She sat down in the chair across from the counter. I chose to stay, Claire. When I realized what this place was, what it needed, I chose to become part of the solution instead of another casualty. And the others? Robert Stenhouse, Sarah Kelly. They made different choices. Some couldn't handle the knowledge and retreated into madness. Others tried to fight the rules instead of working with them. A few simply disappeared. Whether they escaped or were taken, I've never been sure. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, two guardians sharing the weight of impossible knowledge. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps in the parking lot. Through the window, I saw Thomas Ward walking slowly toward his car, but as he moved through a patch of shadow, he seemed to flicker and fade, becoming translucent before solidifying again. He got into his car, which I now noticed didn't have a license plate, and drove away. The engine made no sound. Was he ever real? I asked Mrs. Harrington. Real is a complicated concept here, she replied. He was real enough to be dangerous. But he was also bound by the same rules that protect us. As long as you didn't invite him in, as long as you didn't break the barriers, he couldn't really hurt you. The phone didn't ring at 2:13 a.m. In fact, it didn't ring at all that night. The radio remained silent. The only sounds were the normal ones, the hum of the fluorescent lights, the whisper of wind through the pine trees, the distant hum of traffic on Route 9. It felt like the calm after a storm, as if the events of the previous night had settled something, established a new equilibrium. When dawn broke, I realized I felt at home for the first time since arriving in Maine. Not in my apartment in town, not in my old life in Boston, but here, in this strange place where the impossible was simply another part of the job description. Dalton arrived at 7 a.m., and I gave him a brief report on the quiet night. As I was preparing to leave, he stopped me. "Claire," he said, "I want you to know that you have a choice. You can keep working here, become a permanent part of this place, help maintain the barriers. Or you can leave, find a normal job somewhere else, try to forget what you've learned. What would happen if I left? We'd find someone else eventually. We always do, but—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The people who really understand this place, who can handle the responsibility, they're rare. Most people break under the strain, or convince themselves it was all hallucinations, or simply refuse to believe what they've experienced." I thought about Lisa Chen, who'd fled after one night of unexplained fear. I thought about all the night clerks mentioned in Mrs. Harrington's notebook, who'd lasted days or weeks before disappearing or breaking down. "I'll stay," I said. Dalton smiled. "I hoped you would. Welcome to the Pine Rest Motel, Claire. Really welcome this time." As I drove home that morning, I felt the weight of my new understanding settling over me like a cloak. I was no longer just Claire Bennett, failed paralegal from Boston. I was something else now, a guardian, a keeper of boundaries, a person who stood watch between the normal world and something far stranger and more dangerous. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was the life I'd chosen. And in a world where most people would never understand the real nature of the threats that surrounded them, that felt like purpose enough. The Pine Rest Motel would be waiting for me tomorrow night, and the night after that, and the night after that. The rules would still apply, the shadows would still gather at the edges of perception, and I would still be there to hold the line. It was, I realized, exactly what I needed. 3 weeks later, I was training my replacement, not permanently. I wasn't leaving the Pine Rest Motel, but Dalton had decided we needed backup. Someone who could cover shifts when needed, someone who understood the true nature of the place. Finding the right person wasn't easy, but eventually we'd found Jake Martinez, a 24-year-old former security guard who'd been laid off from his job at a mall in Bangor. Jake had the right temperament, steady, observant, and importantly, someone who'd already seen enough strange things in his security work to not immediately dismiss supernatural explanations. When Dalton had interviewed him and mentioned that the job involved unusual circumstances, Jake had simply nodded and asked about the pay. Now, on Jake's first night, I found myself in the position I'd never expected to be in. The experienced one, passing on knowledge that could save a life. "So these rules," Jake said, holding the laminated sheet with the same skeptical expression I'd had 3 weeks earlier. "You're telling me these are real?" I looked at him across the counter, remembering my own first night, my own confident dismissal of what I'd assumed were just eccentric local superstitions. It seemed like a lifetime ago, though it had been less than a month. "They're real," I said simply. "Follow them exactly or you won't last." Jake laughed just as I had. "Come on, Claire!" I know Dalton likes to mess with new employees, but rule number 2, I interrupted. Do not answer the lobby phone after 2:13 a.m. What do you think will happen if you do? I don't know. Prank call? Angry guest? You'll hear the voice of someone you care about, asking why you won't talk to them. Someone who couldn't possibly be calling this number, someone who might be dead, someone who lives thousands of miles away. And if you keep listening, if you try to have a conversation, they'll learn more about you. Your name, your fears, your weaknesses. Jake's laugh faltered. That's specific. Rule number 3. If you see a guest twice in one night, only speak to the first one. The second one will look exactly the same, but it won't be the same person. It'll be something else wearing their face, and if you interact with it, if you give it the same courtesy you'd give to a real guest, you'll be teaching it how to be more convincing. I pulled out Mrs. Harrington's notebook and set it on the counter between us. This contains 60 years of observations from night clerks who survived long enough to write them down. Some didn't survive. Some went insane. Some simply vanished. I looked Jake directly in the eyes. This isn't a joke, Jake. This isn't hazing or local folklore or an elaborate prank. This place is genuinely dangerous, and the rules are the only thing standing between you and something that wants very badly to break through into the normal world. Jake picked up the notebook with hands that were no longer quite steady. He opened it to a random page and read silently for several minutes. When he looked up, his face was pale. This is all real. Every word. And you've experienced these things? Personally, I nodded. The phone calls, the doubles, the knocking at the back door. All of it. Jake set the notebook down carefully as if it might explode. Why are you telling me this? Why not let me figure it out on my own the way you did? Because I don't want you to end up like Sarah Kelly or Robert Stenhouse or any of the others who didn't make it. I gestured toward the notebook. Because every person who learns these rules the hard way and survives makes the next person's chances a little better. And if I decide this is too crazy, if I walk out right now, then Dalton will find someone else, and I'll have this same conversation with them. But Jake, I leaned forward. You asked for this job because you needed steady work, and you weren't afraid of night shifts. You've already spent years working security, dealing with problems that other people would run from. You have good instincts and a steady nerve. Those are exactly the qualities someone needs to survive here. Jake was quiet for a long time, staring at the laminated rules. Finally, he looked up at me. What happens to people who work here long term? Do they ever get to leave? I thought about Mrs. Harrington, who'd been here for over 50 years, existing in the spaces between life and death. I thought about Dalton, with his hollow eyes and yellow fingers, chain-smoking his way through decades of managing the impossible. I thought about myself, and how the normal world had already started to feel alien and distant. Some do, I said honestly, but most of us find that we don't want to. The world outside doesn't make sense anymore once you know what's really out there. Here at least we understand the rules. Jake nodded slowly. Okay, I'll try it. One night and we'll see how it goes. That's all anyone can do. The shift proceeded normally for the first few hours. We had 4 guests, all of whom seemed genuinely human. Jake familiarized himself with the computer system and the basic procedures, while I shared more specific details from the notebook. Which rooms to avoid assigning, what signs to look for in the registry that might indicate non-human guests, how to tell the difference between normal mechanical sounds and the electrical interference that indicated supernatural activity. Around 1:30 a.m., Mrs. Harrington appeared at the office door. Jake started to get up to help her, but I put a hand on his arm. Mrs. Harrington, I said. Jake, this is Mrs. Harrington. She's been a guest here for a very long time. Mrs. Harrington smiled, and I could see Jake's tension ease slightly. She looked like a perfectly normal elderly woman, the kind who might be anyone's grandmother. Hello, Jake, she said. Claire's told me about you. I hope you'll find your time here educational. Yes, ma'am, Jake replied politely. Mrs. Harrington turned to me. You're doing well with the training. He has the right temperament. After she left, Jake looked at me with questions in his eyes. She's been here since 1969, I explained. She chose to stay, to become part of the place instead of fighting it. She's not exactly human anymore, but she's not dangerous. Think of her as an ally, not exactly human. It's complicated. You'll understand eventually. At 2:13 a.m., the lobby phone began to ring. Jake looked at me, then at the phone, then back at me. That's rule number 2. Right, don't answer it. No matter what you hear, no matter how long it rings, no matter how much you want to, we sat in silence, counting the rings, 20, 30, 40. Jake's hand twitched toward the phone several times, but he kept it in his lap. After 57 rings, the phone fell silent. The radio crackled to life. Jake, honey, is that you? Jake went rigid. I recognized the voice immediately. It was his mother's voice, warm and concerned, exactly the way a worried mother would sound calling to check on her son. Jake, sweetie, why didn't you answer the phone? I've been trying to reach you all night. Jake's hand moved toward the radio and I caught his wrist. It's not her, I said quietly. That's my mom's voice, he whispered. I know, it's not her. Jake, I need to talk to you. There's been an accident. Your father... Turn it off, I said. Jake reached for the radio with shaking hands, but instead of turning it off, he grabbed the microphone. Mom? He said into the radio. Mom, is that you? I lunged for the radio, but it was too late. Jake had already spoken into it, had already acknowledged the voice, had already given it what it wanted. The static cleared, and when the voice came back, it was different. Still his mother's voice, but wrong somehow. Too smooth, too perfect, like a recording that had been cleaned up too much. Yes, honey, it's me. I need you to do something for me. I need you to come outside. Jake, don't listen to it, I said urgently. That's not your mother. But Jake was already standing up, still holding the microphone. Where are you, Mom? Are you hurt? I'm right outside, sweetheart. Just come to the back door. I'm waiting for you there. Rule number 5. If someone knocks at the back door, ignore it. But Jake was already walking toward the back of the office, drawn by a voice that knew exactly how to manipulate him. I grabbed Mrs. Harrington's notebook and followed him, reading frantically as I went. There had to be something in here about breaking people free from this kind of influence. Some way to... Jake, wait, I called, but he was already at the back door. Reaching for the lock, I found what I was looking for and read aloud. The voice on the radio will try to convince you to go outside, to open doors that should remain closed, but it can only repeat information it has already gathered. Ask it something only your real mother would know, something specific and recent. Jake paused, his hand on the deadbolt. Jake, I continued, ask it about something that happened yesterday. Something personal that only she would know. Jake blinked as if waking up from a dream. He keyed the microphone again. Mom, what did we talk about when I called you yesterday? Silence, then. We talked about many things, honey. Important things. Now please come outside. I need to see you. What specifically? Jake pressed. What did I tell you about the new job? More silence. When the voice came back, it was fainter, less convincing. Just come outside, Jake, please. Jake stepped back from the door, his face pale. I never called her yesterday. I haven't talked to my mom in 2 weeks. The radio crackled once more, then went silent. We stood there in the back hallway for several minutes. Jake staring at the door he'd almost opened, me holding the notebook like a shield against the darkness outside. That was close, I said finally. Too close. Jake's voice was shaky. If you hadn't been here, but I was here. And now you know what to expect. The first encounter is always the worst because you don't know what's happening. Now you do. We returned to the front office and Jake sank into his chair behind the counter. How do you stand it, knowing that thing was pretending to be my mother? You learn to live with it, I said, echoing Dalton's words from weeks earlier. And you remember that the real people in your life are safe as long as you don't let these things learn too much about them. The rest of the night passed quietly. When dawn came and Dalton arrived for the morning shift, Jake was still pale but determined. How did he do? Dalton asked. He almost opened the back door, I said honestly, but he caught himself in time. He'll be fine. Dalton nodded and turned to Jake. Welcome to the Pine Rest Motel, really welcome. This time. As Jake and I prepared to leave, he pulled me aside. Claire, I have to ask, do you ever regret taking this job? Do you ever wish you'd just stayed in Boston and found normal work? I thought about it seriously. 3 weeks ago, I'd been a failed paralegal with a broken heart and mounting debt, stumbling through life without purpose or direction. Now I was something else entirely, a guardian standing watch at the boundary between the normal world and something far stranger. No, I said finally. I don't regret it. This place needed someone who could handle the responsibility, and I needed something that made my life matter. It's not the future I planned, but it's the one I chose. Jake nodded slowly. I think I understand. As we walked to our cars in the morning sunlight, I felt a sense of completion I hadn't expected. The cycle was continuing. Another person had been brought into the knowledge, another guardian was taking up the watch. The Pine Rest Motel would continue to stand between the normal world and the shadows that pressed against it. And there would be people who understood the rules to keep it functioning. It wasn't the kind of legacy most people would want, but it was the one this place required. And somehow that felt like enough. The pine trees whispered in the morning breeze, and for once they sounded almost peaceful,